How's it, everyone? Welcome to another edition of my racket collection right here on OpenCourt. So on today's racket collection, I wanted to introduce a very popular racket that is still pretty highly in demand today, and that is the 2015 edition of the Wilson Blade 98. Now this edition of the Wilson Blade is still very popular. I see a lot of people still looking for this racket on eBay and on the secondary market. It's still wanted by a lot of players today because of the unique feel as well as the combination of spin and power. Now this is the 1619 version. There is also an 1820 version, which obviously requires a little bit more skill to use. I have the 1619 one because it gives me a little bit more free power and a little bit more help. So a very brief introduction of this racket. In this edition of the Wilson Blade, Wilson introduced something called Graphite Basalt Layup, which gives it a little bit plusher, a little bit softer feel than the previous generation without sacrificing that crisp response. Also something called parallel drilling on the cross strings over here, as you can see by these lines. It gives a little bit more open sweet spot in the middle, so you get a little bit more help if you hit off center. This version of the Wilson Blade is regarded by many as having that perfect combination of feel, power, and control. The successor to this, which is the Countervail, was pretty unpopular because the Countervail really muted the response, and this version is still regarded as one of the most popular versions of the Wilson Blade. So here are the specs to this Wilson Blade. As you guys can see, 304 grams, 10.7 ounces unstrung weight, but also it has a 32.5 centimeter balance, which actually puts this on the slightly head heavier side. I usually prefer something that's 310 millimeters or less. So this is pretty head heavy, but because of that balance, it packs a lot of plow through. It has good punch. And so a lot of people like this on the ground strokes because as long as they hit the ball in front of their body, they're gonna be able to hit the ball with a lot of pace and be able to push their opponents back. Apart from that, there's nothing too special about the specs. It does have a 21.5 millimeter straight beam, so it's pretty thin, and that's what gives it the excellent control. So the specs to this Wilson Blade 98 is not really in my wheelhouse, so I don't pull it out of my bag that often. But first, let's start with what I do like about this racket. So definitely the thing that I like most about the Wilson Blade 98 is the feel and the response. The stiffness is ideal. It's not too stiff, but it's definitely not on the muted side. I think some people did complain a little bit about the stiffness, which is why in the next generation after this, Wilson introduced the Countervail technology, which swung the pendulum a little too far in the other direction and made it a little bit too muted. This 2015 edition of the Wilson Blade 98 has the perfect response of crispness. Where I strike the ball, it has that very satisfying pop sensation when I strike it solid in the sweet spot, but it also has enough response where I can slice and dice, I can use the drop shots, I can use the short angles. I know exactly where I'm going to hit the ball as long as I make contact in that sweet spot. A lot of rackets these days incorporate technology which is meant for dampening and to help absorb shock that will otherwise potentially injure players' arms. I personally like the molds of the previous generations where it was a little bit stiffer, a little bit crisper to give you that response so you feel really connected to the ball, which this 2015 edition of the Wilson Blade 98 gives me. Although I have not tried any previous blade to this or any succeeding blade after this, I have tried a few of the Countervail rackets and I think those are a bit too muted, and the Wilson Blade 98 2015 has the perfect feel and response. Because it is also a little bit head heavier than a lot of the rackets that are in my collection, it has really good plow through for more power, more plow through than a lot of my other rackets. So the difficult part is the wind up, but once I make contact with the ball in front of me, the weight of the racket does the rest of the work and I can hit a nice heavy deep ball. Also, because it is a 98 with a relatively thin beam at 21.5 millimeters straight, it has phenomenal control. I can take big rips and not have to worry about the ball flying long as I impart spin. I think the string pattern for the Blade 98 1619 edition is a little bit too open for flat hitters. I see myself, if I were a flat hitter, sailing the ball a little bit long. If you are a flat hitter, there is an 1820 version of this with pretty much the exact same specs. That would be the one I would recommend for a more aggressive flat hitter, but if you hit enough spin, I think the 1619 edition will give you the control and the power to go for your shots and to also be able to use touch and feel in your game when necessary. Now getting into the cons, This is a personal con for me, but I like headlight rackets. I like something that's either 310 millimeters or less. This Wilson Blade 98 being a 32.5 centimeter balance is a lot head heavier than a lot of my other rackets, and so I have a difficult time generating spin, especially on the kick serve, where I have to swing from behind my head, swing out and pronate. A headlight racket is a lot easier to pronate with on that kick serve, and I have a difficult time hitting the kick serve with this Wilson Blade 98, and I feel a lot of my kick serves sitting up there for my opponents to attack. On the plus side though, because it has the weight in the head, the slice and the flat feel great, but the kick serve is the serve that I rely on the most because it has the easiest net clearance and the most consistency. That's the serve I use typically on my second serves. The Blade 98 is just too head heavy for me to hit an effective kick serve, and so for me, I would personally customize it a little bit to make it a little bit more head light. I've heard other people complain about the stiffness a little bit. The stiffness doesn't bother me particularly because I like a stiffer racket that will give me the response and feedback necessary to be able to hit into the corners, go for lines, take high risk shots. But if you do have a sensitive arm, this blade might be a little bit stiff for you. So if that's the case, maybe the one after this, the Countervail edition, might be more suited for you. But overall, the Blade series has been one of Wilson's longest running lines for good reason. It's a very popular racket among those advanced players who can strike the ball with aggression and speed. The Blade 98, 1619, as well as the 1820 have great control. If you're an aggressive player, I think the Blade will give you that control. I definitely think the Blade series is a little bit more suited towards ground strokers or baseliners. The slightly head-heavy balance makes hitting reflex volleys a little bit more difficult, but if you have the strength to handle it at the net, then I think this racket with its head-heavy plow-through will definitely be able to pack a punch at the net. But if you're a ground stroker, advanced player, the Blade 98 from the baseline is a magical stick. It has great feel and response, and it's definitely a racket that I would recommend if you have those aggressive strokes and you like a head-heavier racket with a little bit more stability and plow-through. Thank you for watching this edition of my racket collection, introducing the Wilson Blade 98 16x19 2015 edition. If you guys like this content and want to see more like it, be sure you overhead smash that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you on an open court.